And we are rolling. Anyone know the date?
May 5th.
May 5th. It's a beautiful day in Los Angeles. 70 degrees? 65, sorry. Today we're going to be debating the factual question, human activity is responsible for global warming. For the government, Chloe and Laura. For the opposition, Stephanie and Jasmine. Okay.
Hello, my name's Chloe, and this is Laura, and we're here today to represent the government's position on the question of whether or not human activity is responsible for global warming. We argue that human activity is, in fact, responsible for global warming. Now, for the purposes of this debate, we've adopted fair and reasonable definitions to describe human activity, responsible, and global warming. These terms were agreed upon by both the government and opposition teams. We defined human activity as something that people do or cause to happen. Responsible is described as the primary cause, and global warming is described as the long-term warming of the planet. We've also adopted certain criteria in order to properly assess whether or not human activity is responsible or not for global warming. The criteria for assessing truth will be a preponderance of evidence and quality of evidence in favor of the proposition. This provides fair grounds for debate, and it emphasizes the importance of scientific research and fact. Human activity is responsible for global warming. The Earth is warming, greenhouse gas levels are rising due to human activity, greenhouse gases are warming the Earth, and there's a scientific consensus that humans are responsible for it all. First of all, the Earth is warming, and there's no doubt about that. The IPCC, which is an organization that's authored by hundreds of scientists and peer-reviewed by thousands more, argues that human activity is responsible for global warming. In its most recent climate change report, it said that it is virtually certain, which is 99 to 100% positivity, that the global troposphere is warmed since the mid-20th century. And the IPCC is not the only organization to say this. The NOAA, which is another national organization, said that the year 2014 was the warmest year across global land and ocean surfaces since records began in 1880. Additionally, greenhouse gas levels are rising due to human activity. For the past 650,000 years, levels of CO2 have not been above 300 parts per million. All of a sudden, however, in the mid-20th century, they shot up to 400 parts per million, and that's where we're at today. And the global temperature has increased 1.4 degrees since 1880. The dramatic increases in the greenhouse gases levels align with human activity as well. In its most recent climate change report, the IPCC clarifies that carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have all increased since 1750 because of the Industrial Revolution. And as NASA asserts, there's been a one-third increase in carbon dioxide levels since the Industrial Revolution. Now, human activity, the problem is it's emitting unnatural levels of greenhouse gases. The U.S. Global Change Research reports Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States, which is authored by dozens of scholars from institutions like Harvard and Berkeley, assert that global warming is unequivocal and primarily human-induced. The report shares that emissions responsible for human-induced warming come from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, with additional contributions from deforestation and agriculture. Now, greenhouse gases do indeed warm the Earth. Envision the greenhouse gas effect like a thermal blanket that's completely enveloping the Earth. And as more greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, this blanket has more and more insulation. So that means that the Earth is getting warmer and warmer as heat is being trapped inside the atmosphere. And that's what's happening now. greenhouse gas molecules absorb outgoing heat and redistribute it in all directions, which warms the Earth's surface. And while there may have been cyclical warming periods in the past, the warming we're currently experiencing is caused by human activity. Over the past 650,000 years, the temperature has fluctuated, but NASA attributes these to very small variations in the Earth's orbit. Whereas today, however, NASA says the current warming trend is of particular significance because most of it is very likely human-induced, and it's proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented in the past 1,300 years. And modern technology and ice cores reflect these findings as well. Satellites that orbit the Earth have allowed organizations like NASA to gather information on the Earth's climate, and the heat-trapping nature of carbon dioxide and gas was demonstrated in the mid-19th century. We've known about this for a while. And additionally, ice cores, which have been drawn from Greenland, Antarctica, tropical mountain glaciers, they found that global climate change adjusts in response to greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, there's a scientific consensus that this is happening and human activity is responsible for global warming. As NASA explains, 97% of scientists around the world agree that climate warming trends over the past century are likely due to human activities, and most of the leading organizations, scientific organizations worldwide, agree too. There are nearly 200 prestigious international organizations that agree that human activity is responsible for global warming. And in the IPCC's most recent climate change physical basis report, it shares that it is extremely likely, which is 95 to 100% certainty, that human influence is the dominant cause observed in warming since the mid-20th century. So if we think back, we know that the Earth is warming. It's not a question, it's happening. Greenhouse gas levels are rising, and it corresponds with the Industrial Revolution, which means that there's something happening with carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that humans are initially emitting that's causing the Earth to warm. While over the past 650,000 years, we've seen trends not like this. This is different. It corresponds with the Industrial Revolution. It corresponds to the greenhouse gases we're emitting, and it's not just carbon dioxide. Methane, which is another intense gas that produces a strong greenhouse effect, is also being emitted into the atmosphere from human activities such as oil fracturing and oil leaks, and it's a very important issue. And experts actually say that if we don't cap on that, it's going to be an even bigger issue as we move forward. Therefore, with all these contentions, we strongly believe that human activity is responsible for global warming. Thank you. And I now stand for questioning.
Okay, come to the front, please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Come closer so you're within camera range. Thank you. Okay.
We're good to go?
You good to go?
Okay. Chloe, I wanted to just verify that everything you say you are presenting as a fact, correct?
Could you be more specific?
Well, anything that you claimed as a fact, it is, according to the scientists, like the scientific truths.
Yes. Anything I referenced, yes.
Okay. And I wanted to clarify when the Industrial Revolution began, according to you.
Around 1750 is when we started seeing increases in carbon dioxide levels.
Okay. And can you clarify when the mid-20th century was?
Mid-20th century, 1 second, would be like the 1950s.
Okay. Now you said, without a doubt, global warming is occurring, and without a doubt, warming has been observed since the Industrial Revolution. And then a little later, you contest that the warming has, without a doubt, been happening since the mid-20th century. So I just wanted to clarify when the warming has started from.
Well, the warming that we've been seeing since records began was 1880, and since the 20th century, that's when the dramatic increases have started. But the warming that we've noticed has started in 1850.
Okay, so past the Industrial Revolution, it started a little later.
Well, yes, but that makes sense
Okay.
because of the heating time. It takes time.
Yes. Okay, and then You said satellites that orbit Earth have allowed organizations like NASA to gather their information about Earth's climate, correct?
Yes.
Did you do research on satellites before you claimed them as a tool to prove your alleged facts?
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware that they're unequally distributed into regional sections?
Look at the audience, not at Chloe.
Right.
They're the ones you're trying to persuade. Thank you.
Well, I feel like that fact is contested, but that's actually not what I was claiming. I was saying that satellites orbit the Earth that NASA have used have proved the heat-trapping nature of carbon dioxide and other gases, and that was demonstrated in the 19th century. That doesn't necessarily have to do with where they're located, but the facts that they brought back.
Okay. And then, do you think that there are other natural mechanisms that can affect global warming?
Yes, we do, but our argument here is that human activity is the primary cause of the global warming we're experiencing, which is different. We're not saying it's the only cause, but it's the main one.
Okay, and then you mentioned that there was a consensus reached by scientists. Do you think that this is a relevant issue in the debate?
Yes, I do, because scientists have been researching this for decades, and if 97% of the world's scientists have come to the agreement that human activity is responsible for global warming, that's very reflective of what we should be thinking about today. That's way beyond the majority of scientists.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize the leader of the opposition for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'd first like to thank you to the judges and to Professor Miller for allowing me the opportunity to partake in this debate on such an important issue. As I stand before you today, I recognize and realize that many of you have preconceived beliefs about global warming and its causes. Wherever you stand on such a topic, today I urge you to question and contest what you believe to be true. Often, the government and other sources perceived as credible instill certain beliefs about topics such as global warming, making it seem as though a consensus has been reached and thus debate is no longer required. This notion is deeply flawed, and thus, in the words of the infamous writer and physician Michael Crichton, in science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. Thus, today I will not present arguments in favor of popular opinion or belief, but that which is grounded in science and fact. I challenge you to be open to the possibility that what you have always heard or believed to be true may in fact be incorrect regarding global warming. Today, I intend to prove that human activity is not responsible for global warming. The criteria for assessing truth will be a preponderance of evidence and quality of evidence in favor of the proposition. So first and foremost, I want to refute one of the affirmative central claims, namely that the increase in CO2 will produce an increase in temperatures. And I disagree with this because, as I lay out in the following pieces of evidence, this is not always the case. And therefore, CO2 and climate change patterns are not positively correlated. The Non-Governmental Institute Panel on Climate Change, or NIPCC, which was founded by Dr. Fred Singer, a physicist and former professor at the University of Virginia, consists of a group of scientists and scholars, and Forbes describes their reports as produced by scores of scientists from around the world. They cite thousands of peer-reviewed studies and are themselves peer-reviewed. And in one of their recent reports, they emphasize that the relationship between CO2 levels and temperature is poor. For example, Dr. Singer, in his summary of the NIPCC report, reminds us about the two cooling periods that occurred in the 20th century, from 1940 to 1975, and the cooling period that began in 2001, despite the increase in CO2 levels. In one peer-reviewed article by Feng, Zhu, Wang, Yu, and Shen, who researched climate change and ecology in Beijing, Peking University, they analyzed the relationship between CO2 and temperature from 1850 until now and divided the periods into 30-year integrals. And they found that there were 3 of the periods showed a positive relationship between CO2 and temperature, 1 with a negative relationship, and 2 without any significant correlations. Furthermore, they found that the relationship between the annual change of CO2 concentration and temperature was statistically significant, with a p-value lower than 0.05. So even when accounting for the possibility that the temperature chain lags behind the CO2 concentration, all these findings reveal the complexity of the Earth's climate systems, whose mechanisms cannot be simply reduced to one single factor, such as CO2. Also, I want to point out to you, Chloe mentioned one of their major arguments was that we're emitting a significant and a substantial amount of CO2. However, I disagree with this because, as I will present in the following pieces of evidence, the current anthropogenic CO2 emissions are trivial. Therefore, CO2 levels are not as substantial. Human-produced CO2 levels, that is. The IPCC referenced in their third assessment report that most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to an increase in greenhouse gas concentration. And yes, it is the case that CO2 levels have risen from 280 parts per million to 379 parts per million in the last 150 years. But don't allow these numbers to fool you. As stated by Paul Dreesen, a senior policy advisor with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow and Center for the Defense of Free Enterprise, both nonprofits that focus on energy, the environment, economic development, and international affairs, he said that carbon dioxide now makes up just 400 molecules out of every million molecules of gases in the atmosphere, and the other gases include nitrogen, argon, oxygen, and water vapor. Furthermore, Professor Schmidt, an adjunct professor of engineering at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and Professor Happer, professor of physics at Princeton, in a Wall Street Journal article emphasized that current levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, approaching 400 parts per million, are low by the standards of geological and plant evolutionary history. Levels were 3,000 parts per million during the Paleogene period. So it is not the case that the amount of human-produced CO2 levels are unnatural or are significant when we look at the history of the Earth. Okay. And furthermore, I want to argue that we mustn't only limit our understanding of CO2 in terms of the role it plays in the greenhouse gas effect. CO2 also plays another very substantial role. Specifically, it acts as a fertilizer for plants. As articulated by the NIPCC, while rising levels of CO2 would increase global temperatures with all else being equal, all else is not equal. More CO2 also promotes more plant growth both on land and through the surfaces of the world's oceans, and this vast assemblage of plant life has the ability to counteract the heating effects of CO2's thermal radiative forcing. Therefore, although, yes, humans are producing CO2 and the levels are increasing due to the industry and fossil fuel emissions, they are not the cause of global warming, considering CO2's weak correlation with temperature and its indirect ability to counteract global warming effects. So then what then is causing global warming, you may ask? One of the natural causes of global warming includes sunspots. As articulated by Sally Baliunas, a professor from Harvard, from NASA's satellite measurements in the last 20 years, we know that when the magnetism of the sun is strong, the energy of the output of the sun is also more intense. So we can see that there is a positive correlation between sunspots and temperature if we look at various times in history. For example, in the 1700s, a time in the Earth's history when both the temperature and solar activity were low. And in recent years, they found that the sun has been especially active, and that may account then for the increase in temperatures. Furthermore, some additional natural forces that can and do influence climate include El Nino, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and so my team member will continue with this argument later on. Thank you. I now stand over for questions.
Okay.
Okay. Stephanie, I'd just like to clarify that you said that man-made carbon dioxide emissions contribute trivially to the atmosphere, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, do you believe that man-made CO2 emissions contributed trivially in the atmosphere? Does that affect long-term or short-term things?
If they account trivially, they don't have an effect. I'm saying they do have an effect, but the effect is therefore trivial, so it doesn't make sense to argue whether or not it's short-term or long-term. The effect is necessarily trivial, given that the amount is trivial.
And you're referring to their effect on the global temperature?
Yes.
Okay. And even though carbon dioxide is only maybe a small part of the atmosphere, do you believe that a significant increase in that small part could create larger changes?
No, given the facts and the research that I presented, I found that there is not a significant or positive correlation between increasing levels of CO2 and temperature.
Okay. And in your argument, you cite that the NIPCC's claim, which is that the correlation between carbon dioxide levels and temperature is poor, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that the NIPCC authors were paid for their contributions?
I did not find that when I was researching them, so no, I would have to look into that.
Okay. And additionally, are you aware of the fact that the NIPCC's authors are in the dozens, whereas the IPCC has hundreds of authors and thousands of contributors?
Yes, I'm aware of that, but they're also dealing with the populist idea and notion of a scientific consensus. And so a lot of them didn't even want to give their names for fear that they would lose their ability to work at prestigious research institutes. And also, I don't believe that the fact that they're being paid is necessarily a cause to distrust them or not seen as credible. Professors at research institutes are also paid, and we still deem their research credible.
Okay. And you argue that natural things like plant life could counterbalance the effects of carbon dioxide,
Could
correct?
counterbalance, yes. I'm not saying that it's going to eliminate in any way, but they could, yes.
So do you think that could be a long-term solution to counterbalance carbon dioxide emissions?
I don't think we need a long-term solution, given that I'm arguing there are natural mechanisms that cause global warming. So it's a natural process, so that would render my argument.
So do you believe that there might be a situation where there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than plant life can be able to absorb?
Yes. I'm not saying that I'm just saying that it adds to the complexity of understanding the cause of global warming,
Okay.
including aerosols, which also adds to the complexity of understanding, since we don't know whether or not they have a cooling or a warming effect.
All right, and one last question. So you said that El Nino may be a cause of global warming. Do you think that El Nino explains the melting of glaciers?
I did not. Trying to infer the cause of something by its effects is incorrect, and I did not say El Nino is the cause of global warming. Rather, I said El Nino is a natural process that affects temperatures.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd first like to begin by addressing some of the opposition's claims. And Stephanie claimed that man-made CO2 emissions contribute trivially to the atmosphere, but the government disagrees. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in relation to other particles is not necessarily in itself, does not necessarily render that insignificant. While yearly concentrations might trivially contribute to the atmosphere, the accumulation of these small changes over time can cause large increases in parts per million. When you're looking at that, the bigger effect can be in the change in the composition and the change in the percentage of the composition, not necessarily in the numbers itself. For example, to help you think of it a little bit better, sugar is generally not a huge part of your diet, but if you decide to splurge on a candy bar or two, it's still not a large percentage of your diet, but you have increased your intake, and it can cause you to gain a couple pounds. So that kind of relates to how increases in carbon dioxide can, even if carbon dioxide is not necessarily a huge part of the atmosphere, but as it increases in it can accumulate over time and cause significant changes. According to Ed Delotkenke and Peter Tans from the NOAA, greenhouse concentrations are increasing. The parts per million is increasing at increasing rates each year. Back when the records start, in 1959, the yearly rate of increasing is about 0.59 parts per million per year. And now we're up in 2014 in the late 2000s, or the early 2000s, sorry, you start to get up closer to 3 parts per million per year. So it's not just an increase, but it's also an increase in rate. Additionally, Stephanie addressed that the relationship between annual change of CO2 concentration and temperature was statistically insignificant. It's actually no coincidence that the CO2 levels shot up after the Industrial Revolution, and then the temperature followed shortly thereafter. According to NASA, the current warming trend is of particular significance because it's most likely human-induced and proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 1,300 years. And like Chloe said, ice cores have been pulled to demonstrating those effects. Stephanie referenced, or the opposition referenced, the NIPCC, and in our investigation of the NIPCC reports, we have discovered, according to a Greenpeace investigation, the NIPCC has received funding, a substantial amount of funding from ExxonMobil, which is an oil company, which would be if the effects of CO2 were deemed to be negative and if human consumption of oil was deemed to cause more CO2 emissions, that would be harmful to its funders' commercial interests, and in pursuit of that, it could potentially induce bias into these reports, and so I do not believe that the science conducted in the NIPCC reports were valid. This is also the case for the Burlersi, I don't know how to pronounce that, article, and all that the George Mason Foundation, which is what the author is associated with, also receives a substantial amount of funding from ExxonMobil, and also is also a part of a funding group that has anonymous funds, so that large donors can donate anonymously without having those records tracked. Also those records, that science is not necessarily representative of true science due to this bias. And that science was applied to the claim that plant life is able to efficiently absorb, not entirely all as they claimed, or as they stated, but that it's able to reabsorb some of the CO2 that is in the atmosphere. That is actually not true. Forests and trees are unable to absorb and are increasingly unable to do so. As there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, rather than encouraging and promoting more growth, it actually increases the tree's metabolisms. According to researchers at the University of Leeds in Britain, it actually increases the metabolic rate. So basically, they live faster and die younger. So they're actually able to consume less CO2 than if there were fewer trees that were living longer. She also applied that research to sunspots as a natural cause of global warming. And so that has been invalidated. But now research from NASA states that since 1978, satellite instruments have been collecting the energy output of the sun directly, and the satellite data shows very slight drop in the solar iridescence and actually not an increase in the energy. So the likelihood that the sun is increasing, the sun is in, so the sun doesn't appear to be responsible for the warming trend that has occurred over the past 30 years. And I will now take the open for questions.
6:38. Okay. Good. Stand close together so the camera can see you. Thank you.
Okay. So you reference, in refutation to a lot of my claims, you reference the credentials of my research on the grounds that due to their funding, they're consequently invalid. Is this correct?
Yes.
Where's your evidence to support your claim that just because you're funded by something, you have to then produce results in favor of your funding?
You don't have to, but if there is a commercial interest, if you're receiving monetary compensation for any act that you're doing, it's extremely likely that you will produce research that is in favor of that. If you produce research that is against your funder, then that can cause you to lose funding and lose your paycheck and thus lose your job, which is a highly motivating factor.
Okay. So you state natural causes alone cannot explain the warming we have observed since the Industrial Revolution. Do you think natural causes contribute in any way to global warming?
Yes.
Do you think humans emit unnatural amounts of greenhouse gases?
Yes.
The EPA states that in 2008, the U.S. produced 19% of the global CO2 emissions. Would you say this is a substantial amount?
Can you repeat the question?
So the EPA states that the U.S. produced 19% of global of carbon emissions in 2008. Is this a substantial amount?
The 19% of the global emissions, that's quite a high rate for, but I am not sure compared to other large global powers.
Okay. And would you argue then we should see a substantial increase in the regional temperature of the U.S. given the substantial amount of CO2?
Yes.
Okay, so you cite one article and you say that recent climate change has caused an increase in mean temperature on Earth by 0.8 degrees Celsius during the last century with spatially heterogeneous change. Can you explain what is meant by spatially heterogeneous change in temperature across Earth?
That simply means that the whole Earth is not warming at the same constant rate. Certain areas do, influenced by various other factors. They're warming overall at separate rates. The rate of one area might be a little faster or a little slower, but overall we're seeing a global trend in increasing the temperature globally, regardless of individual regional temperatures.
Okay. And just to confirm, you think there's a scientific consensus regarding global warming being caused by human activity, correct?
Yes, there are strong evidence. Many scientists do believe that. 97% of scientists believe that this is true, which would lead to believe scientific consensus due to the repetitive nature of the scientific method.
Okay, and then would you agree that despite the existence of a consensus alone does not suffice to support the contention human activity is responsible? Yes?
Okay, sorry, that human activity is not responsible?
Do you think that despite the existence of a strong consensus alone does not suffice as an argument for human activity is responsible for global warming?
Not alone, but in conjunction with the other evidence that we have and will provide. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair will now recognize the member of the opposition for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Can I go?
You have a substitute timer. She'll give you 4, 3, 2, 1. Half fist means pounding means.
Yeah. I can go?
Yeah.
Okay. During this fact debate, I will be arguing that human activity is not responsible for global warming. Despite the popular notion of holding popular word or scientific consensus to reveal the facts, Stephanie and I mostly did research on independent sources. As you've seen, much of our work was cited from professors who wrote peer-reviewed academic journals or books. Chloe and Laura both frequently cited from the IPCC. NASA was also another popular source of information. Although generally reputable, a critical thinker could see how possible manipulation or motivation behind research resulting in biased results are then presented as facts. First, I would like to refute a point that they make that the Earth is warming. In general, their argument is invalid. Simply stating that the Earth is warming does not prove human activity caused the warming. Because Laura and Chloe both just said, oh, the Earth is warming. Here's proof that it's warming. They are merely proposing the idea that the Earth is warming. Unless correlation now means causation, even if it was an absolute truth that the Earth is constantly warming, it would illustrate no fault of humans in that role. Also, we exhibited that the NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, James Hansen, claims that the Earth's temperatures have not risen since the last 15 years. Another recent article by The Economist called The Cooling Consensus also agrees that since 1998, which was the warmest year of the 20th century, temperatures have been cooling and many scientists agree. Along with their empty statement, she backs it up with the evidence that a professor at UC Berkeley who was a skeptic, but no longer is since he found an increase in 1.5 degrees Celsius in the past 250 years, she backs that up with that evidence that a professor was a skeptic and no longer is. This is just another empty statement saying that one person was a skeptic and they changed, but that still does not tell us about the human contribution and how humans are at fault for global warming. Another one of their claims is that a variability of solar radiation is not statistically significant enough to explain observed variations in the Earth's climate. We disagree because what makes solar variation not significant? She failed to understand that other natural factors play into making the solar radiation significant in warming the Earth's climate. Danish Meteorologist Institution's research found that 65% of the Earth is covered with clouds. Cloud coverage makes solar radiation relevant since cloud coverage can greatly impact temperatures by trapping solar radiation or letting it go. Studies by Professor Ken Dekar, who has his doctorate in meteorology, took the different factors of greenhouse gases and their impact on global energy balance, which basically means the amount of solar radiation that gets trapped in the environment and therefore heats up our planet. He then did the same study on clouds and their impact on global energy balance and found that the global energy trapped showed that clouds in the sky had a strong influence on weather patterns. The temperatures were higher from cloud coverage than they were from CO2 impact. If we are talking statistical significance, surely an average of 65% cloud coverage trapping solar radiation is more significant than 5% of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and even a smaller portion of that being man-made. Therefore, although solar radiation alone is not significant enough to affect the warming, other natural causes play factors in enhancing the solar radiation's effects on warming the planet, therefore making it significant. So, as we can see, my last refutation is that Laura states that there is a strong correlation between greenhouse gases and temperature increases, especially when we observe regions of the world. We disagree because our research has shown that the correlation fails to consider other factors that could be manipulating these results. Professor Feng, who researches climate at the University of Beijing, shows that a strong correlation between higher temperatures in region is due to the urban heat island effect. This is that when there are more populations, there are higher temperatures. So now we see that satellites have been placed. His research also showed that satellites were placed regionally. In a lot of places where there are more populations, we see more satellites. And in other locations with less populations, like small cities, satellites are seen to be sparse or non-existent. So therefore, that proves that there can be a manipulation in the results. In order for us to have an accurate average temperature, we need equal distribution of satellites. Too many satellites in hot zones or too little in cool zones will make temperatures look higher. On top of satellites being skewed, global warming science is also found to be more inaccurate through models. A prestigious school, MIT, which is the 7th best school in the nation, is home to Professor Linson, who is a professor of meteorology there. His studies are very well-rounded in global heat transport and studying history of climate change. Linson disputes the accuracy of computer modeling that climate scientists rely on for future projections of temperatures. He says it's impossible to untangle the man-made CO2 from the CO2 produced from nature. So models that compare temperature changes of CO2 levels are not a fair representation of the man-made CO2 effects on climate change. This allows man-made CO2 effects to look exaggerated. Although scientists use inaccurate measuring tools to try and prove a point, climate change patterns and CO2 patterns are still not positively correlated, as Stephanie proved out. We have seen several periods in time where the CO2 is rising, yet temperatures go down or are stable. For a fact, CO2 levels have been rising during times when the weather doesn't. How do we explain this mystery? Well, it's no mystery. CO2 and temperatures do not have positive correlation, so we can't explain the patterns. So we can't expect the patterns to move together. How do we explain this? We explain it through natural rules. Solar activity, as Stephanie has explained, has taken a big role in these weather changes. With cloud coverage impacting us, we've seen throughout history that several times the temperatures have gone down when carbon dioxide levels are going up. In conclusion, by refuting the insubstantial evidence that humans are responsible for global warming and by exploiting the truth about science, our evidence is in favor of the proposition that human activity is not responsible for global warming.
Thank you. It's now time to hear a cross-examination of this fine speech. So get within camera range. Yes. Okay, we're good, I guess. Can you move over that way a little bit? Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're rolling.
Okay, so you say that computer models don't provide enough evidence of anthropogenic global warming, correct? Just meaning human-caused.
No, I know that. I say that they provide inaccurate evidence.
Okay, so they're inaccurate to show causation for CO2 causing temperature increases, correct? That's what you're arguing.
I'm arguing that it's not an accurate representation of human activity in temperature increases.
Okay, and you said that larger predictions of warming from climate models are due to the fact that other greenhouse gases such as water vapor and clouds amplify.
Out here.
Amplify whatever CO2.
Out here,
Yes.
look out
Does-
here. You're trying to persuade us. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. But earlier in your first contention, did you argue that CO2 contributes trivially to the overall consumption in the atmosphere and therefore has limited effects?
It does.
And then, do you believe that the heat island effect hinders instruments' ability to track the change in temperature across time?
The heat island effect contributes to... Can you repeat the question?
Do you believe that the heat island effect hinders instruments' ability to track the change in temperature across time?
Yes.
Okay. Because you emphasize the urban heat island effect, do you believe that the presence of humans in a specific local area has an effect on that temperature?
Yes.
Okay. And now, are you arguing that temperature has been stabilizing when you claimed the last 15 years the temperature has been flat?
Yes.
Do we have the ability to see evidence or lack thereof global warming in the past 15 years alone?
Can you...
Like, are we able to see one way or the other in just 15 years if global warming exists?
No, but your argument poses that as CO2 level rises, temperature will rise, and so if CO2 levels are rising, then the temperature should be rising.
Okay, so we agreed upon the definition of global warming as the long-term warming of the Earth, correct?
Correct.
Would you consider the past 15 years to be long-term?
No, but I think it has to do with your argument of just the pattern and positive correlation.
Right. Sorry. I don't know.
That's it.
Thank you so much. It's now time for rebuttals. So, let us first entertain a rebuttal. Focus the camera. Thank you. Not to exceed 5 minutes in length.
I would like to reiterate and highlight one last time why it is that you should side with the opposition. Namely, human activity is not responsible for global warming. I would like to remind you of some of the affirmative points and our grounds for rejecting their claims. First, they argued that some of our sources, including the NIPC, were uncredible on the grounds that they received funding from various groups or organizations. I disagree with this simply because a particular group or a particular individual funds something does not necessitate or render the resulting science illegitimate. Therefore, sources such as the NIPC are indeed reliable and are comprised of numerous scientists and are peer-reviewed, just like any other group of scientists. So first, they also posit that human activity is responsible for global warming. We disagree because the historical record of Earth's climate shows that natural causes, including solar activity, have and thus will continue to cause fluctuation in the Earth's climate. Therefore, human activity is not responsible for global warming. Rather, global warming is caused by natural mechanisms. They also stated that humans are emitting significant levels of CO2, which cause an increase in temperatures. I disagree because although it is accurate to recognize the role CO2 plays in the greenhouse effect, namely ensuring the Earth is warm enough to sustain life, the evidence I previously presented to you from various sources, including the NIPCC and a group of scientists from Beijing, found that the relationship between increased CO2 levels and the temperature is weak at best. Therefore, despite the increasing emissions of man-made CO2, these emissions do not create or cause an increase in temperature. The facts I presented shed light on the truth regarding global warming and its cause. Specifically, I illustrated that human activity alone does not suffice to explain the current state of the climate. In conclusion, this afternoon you have heard several arguments supported with evidence in the form of statistics and quotes, both in support of the resolution that human activity is responsible for global warming and against the resolution. Regardless of where you once stood on the issue, I urge you to side with my position of the opposition. Given our connection and dependence on the Earth, it certainly makes sense for all of us to feel connected and perhaps slightly panicked when we hear words like global warming or climate change. Furthermore, when we hear that humans may in fact be the cause of such warming, we feel a sense of responsibility. Although such a response is natural and innate, I ask you try and detach yourself from such an emotional response and instead look at the facts for what they are. I hope that the assertions, reasoning, and evidence I provided you with today will expose you to the truth about global warming and its cause. Furthermore, I hope that you have come to better understand the weak correlation that exists between CO2 and temperature. Many of the affirmative arguments were rooted in such contentions, namely when CO2 levels go up, so too do temperatures. Earlier, we expressed our reasoning for disagreeing with such a claim, including the temperature flat that has been going on and illuminates that not that, global warming isn't happening on the short term, but rather sheds light on and undermines the scientists that do propose man-made global warming, who predicted particular temperatures, and the temperature flat has proved otherwise and shown otherwise in the last 15 years. So I would like to leave you today with the same quote I used to commence my speech this afternoon about consensus science, since our opponents did rely on that appeal a lot. So in science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. Thank you, judges and audience members, for the opportunity to present our case, and we do hope that you side with the opposition on the issue of human activity and whether or not it is responsible for global warming.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay. Chair will now recognize the leader of the government.
Human activity is responsible for global warming. The opposition says that computer models are inaccurate, but I disagree because nearly 200 prestigious organizations worldwide state that human activity is responsible for global warming. And these aren't necessarily organizations that are communicating with each other and pulling off of the same data. These are independent studies that are being conducted, and they all come to the same conclusion. And in that sense, I believe that a consensus is important. Organizations such as the American Meteorological Society, the French Academy of Science, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the International Council for Science all have come to the conclusion that human activity is responsible for global warming. Additionally, independent organizations are independently collecting data and finding similar results. For instance, the NASA Institute, the Met Hadley Office Center for Climatic Research Institute, the NOAA, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency all have drawn very similar graphs of the temperature changes that we've seen since 1880. Therefore, accurate modeling is indeed reflected in a good consensus, and it is therefore safe to say that human activity is responsible for global warming. In addition, the opposition says that carbon dioxide and climate change patterns are not positively correlated. I disagree, however, because as NASA elaborates, the current warming trend is of particular significance because it's not unlike anything we've seen in the past 1,300 years. Something about what we're seeing in the past, say, 250 years is different than what we've experienced before. Additionally, ice core samplings from Greenland, Antarctica, tropical mountain glaciers have found that the global climate does indeed adjust to greenhouse gas emissions. And those greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing today and those increased levels are because of human activity. Therefore, there is indeed a positive correlation between carbon dioxide and climate change. There's an increase in gas emissions because of human activity. Therefore, human activity is responsible for global warming. Thirdly, they say that the dramatic temperature changes in the past have occurred. And I disagree because it's not necessarily what's important right now. What we're dealing with is a different kind of temperature change that's caused by increases in greenhouse gas levels that are spurred by human activity. Additionally, they say natural causes like solar activity are somewhat responsible for global warming. And I disagree. We aren't necessarily debunking the influence of the sun. Rather, we're saying that right now that is not the primary source. Human activity is. As NASA explained since 1750, the average amount of energy from the sun has either remained constant or increased slightly. But this change has not been enough to result in the changes we're seeing now in global temperatures. In fact, they've actually observed that the sun is actually lowered in temperature in the recent past. Additionally, the opposition admitted that humans have regional effects on temperature through the urban island effect. And if humans actually have regional influence on temperature, what's not to say that they have global influence as well? When you have multiple regions, you get the globe, so why are we sectioning this off? That regional reflection is a reflection of the entire globe in itself and the influence that human activity has on global warming. In addition, the opposition argues that we've seen brief cooling periods in the 20th century, but I disagree that this is relevant to this case. As Laura pointed out, our definition of global warming is long-term global warming. If we're going to section it off into small chunks of time, that's not necessarily looking at the overall trend. Climate is a long-term effect. Weather is more day-to-day. If we're looking at a period of 10 years, why don't we look day-to-day? Or hour to hour, what's the difference? We're looking long-term. Additionally, the opposition says that a consensus is irrelevant, but I disagree. In this case, the consensus is the icing on the cake. We have the scientific backing. Science is on our side. Human activity is responsible for global warming, and there's tons of evidence that shows that this is the case. And the fact that 97% of scientists around the world agree with this means that it's most likely the case. Human activity is indeed responsible for global warming. And at this point, the question should not be what's responsible, because we've answered that question. It should be, what do we do now? We're responsible for global warming, but that also means we're responsible for stopping it. And we have that power to control greenhouse emissions, to control the way we do, to limit the urban effects, all of that things, we have the power to control that, to provide for a future generation that lives on a planet that's not increasingly getting hotter, and this fear that we have control over. We have the power to stop global warming because we're responsible for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we going to have 2 more rebuttals, or is that we just have, that's it? Okay, let's give them a round of applause. Okay, now it's time for your individual consultation with yourself. You can look at this little list and say, You can look at the topic. You have to make a decision. Then you have to assign 1, 2, 3, 4 and points between 70 and 80. No low point win.
What is a low point win?
Forget low point win. Oh, you want a low point win? No, I don't want low point win. This is too complicated. Just keep it simple.
They have to only do between 70 and 80. Like, can't give anyone 40 outside of those range.
Why? You want to give somebody 100?
I mean, maybe.
Okay.
Just because an 80.
Hey, this is America. Give somebody 100. I'm just saying the norm is the norm is 70 to 80. But this is America, so you can give anywhere from 1 to 100.
What constitutes an A?
80.
Okay.
Nothing on your paper constitutes an A.
Okay, don't look at your partner's vote. And then when you get it done, pass it over to me. Okay. Now, can you do this later and make you going from left to right, back to
It's fact value.
fact value. The way it's going to be, the way it's going to come down. We don't need writing in black. Yeah, black. Yeah.
Do you want us to rip off the page?
You rip off the page and hand it to me, please. And you sign it.
You want us to give RFDs or no?
And you put a few RFDs, but you mainly are going to put your RFDs on another piece of paper on notes you've taken. So just a couple of RFDs. You know what RFDs are? Reasons for decision. Sorry, we're talking slang. Yeah, thank you. Okay, do you have fact debate number 1 there? Write it in a little bigger print.
Okay.
Yeah. Back to the bigger print. Thank you.
Thank God.
No, a couple weeks ago, but I haven't touched it yet.
It's not like I stayed in
Does anybody have a stapler?
I like wanted to die in my own.
Yeah.
I did any of my observations, and then I just ended up flipping pages so last week.
Yeah. No, I was just like.
Yep, they get better towards the end.
Same.
Yeah, it's
Like
good.
when you like black out, and you're like, what did you say?
In the back, they get bigger.
We were presenting to Stephanie on the
I want them to be,
Yeah, I know,
I want them to go
Stephanie
middle
wasn't-
side.
And then like
That's why I gave you middle side. Oh, so it goes left, middle side, left, middle side. Yeah, here. So go left, middle side. So it's easy to read. Do I have all the ballots?
No, I'm sorry.
Take your time. This is important deliberation. Do I have all the ballots?
Oh, I have mine here.
Now I have all the ballots? Okay. Okay, are you ready for the decision?
Yes.
In a very close decision, on an 11-9 vote, the ballot goes to the government. The human activity is responsible for global warming. We'll start here in front. Stand up, say your name.
Hi everyone, I'm Steve.
Hi, Steve.
You want me to just...
How'd you vote?
Okay, so for me, originally I was on the...
Chloe, can you give us light, please? Thanks. The white one. The white one, yeah.
Okay, so originally I was on the opposition side, but overall, the government side, I felt as they did more better structure, and they were very more cohesive with each other. And as an ending note, they did a really good job in giving us like a sense of responsibility. And like, for example, they said we're the ones who caused it, therefore we should fix it, and it kind of resonated in me. So like, that's how I really overall they had a better team presentation. That's how I really.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
My name is Tao.
Hi, Tao.
So I voted for the government because I thought like as like a presentation wise they did a lot better job. I thought they were more dynamic and like more like authoritative in their presentation than the opposition. And I felt that the opposition didn't do like as good of a job as like in answering the propositions like cross-examination. So I felt that kind of hurt them a bit.
So cross-examination was relevant to you.
Hi, I'm Maral.
Hi, Maral.
I actually voted for the opposition. I wanted to start by saying I thought you guys all did really well, and I'm not just saying that. It was definitely really, really difficult because I liked individual things about both of your teams, but I just felt that the opposition, although the government made a lot of really good points, the opposition's strong points to me were like very strong points. For example, I do like how you spent a lot of time kind of addressing the fact that about the funding and everything, because that wasn't really that valid to me. That being said, though, I think you guys were all really strong. Chloe, you were really good. And yeah, you guys all did really well.
Thank you.
Like her, I also voted
Start
for the
with your
opposition.
name, please.
Guyana. Hi.
Hi, Guyana.
I actually kind of started this whole debate on the opposition side. I think I always just kind of believed human activity isn't responsible, so the burden was kind of on you guys to prove me wrong. And yeah, I liked that.
How'd you vote? I missed that. How'd you vote? You voted opposite.
Yeah.
So you started there and you stayed there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought you all had like really strong points and good things about each person. As a debater, just for the I think they reaffirmed a lot of my initial facts or beliefs that I had about global warming. So yeah.
Okay. Great. Yes, please.
I'm Sol.
Hi, Sol.
And I voted for government. Kind of the opposite of her. I am a strong believer that human activity is responsible for global warming. So you guys have the job of switching my mind.
Changing your mind.
And I just overall think that you guys all did a really good job. And I just think that government provided a more compelling case for how human activity is responsible, especially because I do believe in scientific consensus. I don't think it's something irrelevant that we can just shit on pretty much. So sorry for that. But I do think that shoot on, yes. I believe that scientific consensus is important. So for that reason.
Okay. So scientific consensus. Yes, please.
So, hi, my name's Gabby.
Hi, Gabby.
I do kind of believe that human activity is responsible for global warming. I did, however, vote for the opposition. I thought you guys were both groups were really, really good. So it was kind of a hard decision for me to make. But I felt like, although you guys, the government had a very strong argument, I felt like the argument was more that global warming is happening and that it is real, rather than this is how human activity is responsible for it. Mm-hmm. So that's why I kind of sided more with the opposition, although that's not my personal beliefs, but for the sake of this debate,
okay,
you guys all did a really good job.
Well, we're going to leave political correctness at the door, okay? Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Austin.
Hi, Austin.
So I actually voted for the proposition as well. So basically, my reasoning behind it was I didn't necessarily go for the idea that the scientific consensus was indicative of the truth. I did give you that. But I thought that overall, when we look at preponderance of evidence, I thought there's more valid, especially bringing up the monetary motivation behind certain organizations. And I thought that they used Crossfire more effectively. And I enjoyed that.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I voted for the government. I think one part of it is just that I did believe that already. I think, Stephanie, you did a really good job in addressing the fact that most of the audience weren't siding with you in the beginning when you kind of introduced it and you tried to get us to put our beliefs behind it. I thought that was a really good idea. But ultimately, I think that the government did have just better facts, better evidence behind the argument, and Chloe did a really great job at the end with the call to action. That was really strong.
Hello, my name's Elliot.
Hi, Elliot.
I sided with the government. I started out that way too, so it was y'all's burden, like you said, to kind of prove me wrong. But I chose the government for a few reasons. I think that Chloe did a really good job. You're really good at engaging the audience and being authoritative. And I think that you guys, y'all's passion about it was really intriguing because it just made me feel more passionate about what was being debated anyway. But I think both sides did really, really well, and I thought all of the evidence and arguments you guys had was great. I just felt more strongly about the government's arguments. I felt they were just stronger, and I thought that Chloe did a good job too of showing us the kind of the immediacy of the situation. But I think that both teams did little things here and there that were really great. Like you brought up the pre-existing notions. I thought that was like really good that you did that, and also the quote was strong too that you used twice, because it just like recaptured the audience after we had kind of drifted away a little bit from your attention. So I think that you guys did different techniques that were really respectable, and your arguments are really great. But I did favor the government.
Hi, I'm Colleen.
Hi, Colleen.
So I also voted for government. I thought that like you both gave really good facts and stuff, but I just thought the government presented it in a better way. And then I also liked your cross-examinations better than the opposition. And then I think you guys showed your passion a lot, and that was a big thing to sway me more to the government, because it made me think like, if they're passionate, then it must be important, and they must be right. So that's why I think most of my decision was based on presentation more than facts, because you guys all gave good facts and you like supported them. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Yasmin.
Hi, Yasmin.
I thought that each of you debated well, but I sided with the proposition. I just thought that you guys had a really strong debate overall. When you were cross-examined, you answered with facts that you had already presented in your argument, and I really liked that agenda-setting quality that you guys had to your overall argument. And then more so, you really struck when you invalidated their facts by bringing up the whole financial funding thing, and when you brought that up, I was completely on for proposition. So, well done.
Hi, I'm Miranda.
Hi, Miranda.
I sided with the opposition. While I thought that Chloe's concluding statement was really powerful, I do feel the same way as mentioned, that the actual argument was more so arguing the existence of global warming rather than that it should be attributed to human activity. So I sided with the opposition because I thought it was very clear, concise, and held true to the facts.
Thank you, Miranda. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Garrett.
Hi,
Garrett.
I sided with the opposition mainly because they did really well with the questioning. They did really well with cross-examination as well. And that quote that you said in the beginning it holds true. Like you said, the consensus isn't. I mean, there's certain things in science that are irrefutable, of course, but for the most part, it was strong. So you caught me there. So good job.
Yes,
Hi, I'm Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan.
I sided with the opposition even though I walked in believing in the government. That's because I believe Stephanie had really strong composure. She was very stern in her speaking. Her questioning was ruthless, and I liked that a lot. I also feel that she debunked a lot of the arguments that the other side put on. And her closing statement, of course, with the consensus, because we've seen that in the past, like that mistake's been made a lot, and we don't really know if that's happening right now. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Niaz. I sided with the government. I thought both sides were really well, but I just thought the government was a bit more passionate, and I felt like they were more knowledgeable when it came to cross-examination. And but I really liked both, and I really liked Stephanie's altogether. And it was a really hard decision, but I ended up getting convinced by the government at the really end.
Good, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Amanda.
Hi, Amanda.
While I found both arguments really compelling, I ended up siding with the opposition. And I did that because I felt that all of their evidence and all of their claims did a really good job of just coming together and like supporting their main points. I didn't think they had many points that were much weaker than their other ones. And although the government gave them really a tough time with their cross-examination, I felt like they kept their composure and really showed their knowledge of what they were presenting in order to verify their evidence.
Okay. Thank you. Yes,
Hi,
please.
I'm Lexi.
Hi, Lexi.
I sided with the government because it's been said before, but I think the way that you guys presented it was a lot more compelling. Especially Chloe, you were super passionate about everything that you said, so that was very persuasive. Also, during the cross-examinations, I think that you guys answered the questions more readily, but I think that both sides did a great job.
Thank you, Lexi.
Hi, I'm Sam.
Hi, Sam.
So I came in siding with the government and decided to stay siding with the government. But I'm like, all right, I really believe this, so it would have been really hard to persuade me. I thought both of you teams were super well prepared. I was really impressed with how easily you understood the cross-examination questions, which can sometimes, you ask for rephrasing, but I mean, everyone sometimes gets flustered. And I thought the references you guys had were really good. Someone mentioned NASA, I think that was Chloe, and someone also mentioned the Harvard professor. Those stood out to me, and that they were very reliable sources that everyone had heard of, and I felt very credible. So good job.
Yes, please.
Hey, I've got you.
Hi, Ken.
Yeah, my original position coming into the debate was for government, but I mean, I still have that position. I still think that human activity is largely responsible for global warming, but I actually I sided with the opposition because I appreciated her rebuttals. They're pretty clear and cohesive, and also I like that she mentioned how consensus bias is not a legitimate claim for it doesn't make something valid, because at one point the consensus about the solar system was that it was heliocentric.
Right.
And that was the consensus. That was the prevailing model of the solar system. And now we know it's debunked. So.
It's a great point. And there are other consensus that have been debunked. It's the history of science. Yeah.
Hi,
Yes, please.
Shodai.
What's your name?
Shodai.
Shodai. Hi, Shodai.
So I sided with the opposition group. That's mainly because I think most of their evidences was on the topic. Their evidences were supporting that human activities is not responsible for global warming, and for the government group, I thought their evidences were more global warming is actually happening, but it wasn't human activities is responsible for global warming. So that's maybe why I decided opposition.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
Hi, I'm Aubrey.
Hi, Aubrey.
Hi. I came in actually siding with the opposing side, but then I switched to government because while both sides I thought had really convincing evidence, I thought that the government side they delivered it better. I thought they were more passionate, and it just made them seem way more credible in their deliverance. So.
Okay, good. Let me make a couple of comments. I assume you want to make a couple of comments. Did we get everyone?
Yeah.
Did we skip anyone? No. Okay, let me make a couple of comments. One thing I want you all to notice is that you all,